Right, good afternoon. So welcome to this afternoon's LJMU podcast for the Centre for Educational Research. So this afternoon we're going to be talking around the theme of community education and embodied pedagogic practice. And with me today I've got Aidan Jolly. So Aidan is associated with Collective Encounters and is also a PhD researcher at Edge Hill University. And for anybody that doesn't know me, I'm obviously Craig Hammond, reader in Pedagogies and Critical Theory at LJMU. So Aidan, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your activities and practice?
Yeah, very briefly. Just worth mentioning that I'm obviously here as me. I'm not here to represent Collective Encounters or Edge Hill University.
Yeah.
But having said that, what I do at Collective Encounters is I am what's called the co-artistic director for research, because we run a number of different programs in the city and the city region, all of which work with people who are in some way or other on what I would describe as the front line of various harmful government policies and also kind of developments in society at the moment that are obviously go a bit more deep than a given government policy.
Yeah.
And we have been in the city, we've been working since 2004. We began in North Liverpool because at that time North Liverpool was a place where there was not much on offer in the way of cultural activity or opportunities for people in that area. I joined the company in 2012. I had to think about that. And the work that I did at that time was actually in St Helens, which obviously has a quite distinctive culture from Liverpool itself. And the work that I did there was really an open group for people who define themselves as having experience of mental ill health at some point in their lives.
Yeah.
We run a number of different programs. So we run programs, we have a women's program, we have a program for adults, which anyone can join. And I imagine that you'll be sharing details of the company at some point. Does it go out on a website then? Does it attach to the podcast?
Yes, yeah. So
Yeah.
what we will so the recording will go on the Ceres YouTube channel, Spotify channel, but also what I'll be creating a kind of sway site for each of the podcasts as well. So any additional readings or links, etc.,
Right.
can be kind of attached to that.
Lovely.
So it's to try to develop a bit of a kind of
Yeah.
dynamic rather than just kind of posting a recording. There'll be other links and kind of maybe a message function as well. So
Fantastic. Well, that means that obviously people can look us up and they'll find us, I hope, but also it means there'll be a website available.
Yes.
So as I was saying, we have an adult program open to anyone over 18. We will also worked and are working, in fact, right now with looked after children. We tend to do that in half term and the summer holidays. That's another program that we run. There are a number of other programs that are important to mention. We work with young migrants. We're in the process of creating a sound walk with migrant people and with our core groups. That's a project with Liverpool University. And we're also, we run something called the Centre for Excellence in Participatory Theatre, which is mainly online, but also does training in the real. Again, these are things that people can Google, but the key purpose of the Centre for Excellence is we provide training for anyone who's interested in the kinds of pedagogies that we use, that we'll hopefully unpack a bit later.
we certainly will.
And we provide training in certain specific aspects of practice for facilitators, one example being trauma-informed practice, but we also look at models of sharing information that are, we hope, more democratic than the conventional ways of doing that. Some of that is known as open space. We have also have showcases for people who are making interesting work. And the most important thing about Collective Encounters is that we are a theatre for social change company. And again, that's something I think we're going to unpick a bit more.
Definitely.
But we have a very specific kind of take on the world and on our place in that. And that's, a very important part of our practice. So we're not just trying to tell stories about the world, we're trying to enact change in a progressive direction, because, of course, change, as we know from the past however many years, most of my adult life anyway, change is contradictory. Things change all the time. Things change in very complex ways, and it's a really long-winded way of saying you win some, you lose some. Basically. So we achieve certain kinds of liberation in certain contexts, and at the same time other rights and other voices that we wish to listen to or that we wish to express are getting pushed back all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
complexity is very much part of the kind of sets of concepts I think that we might talk a bit more about in a minute.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I had no idea it had been operating since 2004. So I think that's the same year that CERES, the Centre for Educational Research, was actually incepted and created.
Wow.
Right. So in relation to your community work, etc., and kind of making some connections between both our work as well. So we're going to look at a range of questions. So we will start with the first question, which is, in relation to your experience, insights and ongoing research, what is the current state of political education and critical thinking?
Okay. So before we get in deeply into that, I'm going to try a little experiment. Okay. Now, I've got an example of a program of change here with me. I'm going to read out some of the aspects of this program of change, and I want people who might be listening to this to think about each aspect of the suggested program for change and to kind of gauge your instinctive reactions to this. So I'll read out, it's got 10 points. Mm-hmm. I'll read out each point. Craig, you'll have your reactions. Maybe the team over there will have their reactions, and hopefully people watching the podcast, listening to the podcast, might have an instinctive gut reaction to this, okay? So the point 1, abolition of private ownership of land, with the exception perhaps of people's, small holdings, gardens and so on. That's point 1. Also, that's related to rents made in the technical sense from the profits from land. Point 1, okay? How do you feel about that? Shall we abolish private ownership of land on the large scale? Point 2, high progressive income tax. How do we feel about that? So this is addressing anyone watching this, but also you're smiling. You probably think that might be a good thing.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, good so far. Abolition of inheritance. Might be a little bit more tricky if there may be people listening who are lucky enough to be able to study because of inheritance, for example. So there's, this is complicated, but generally speaking, do we think that inherited wealth should be passed down or not?
Yeah.
The fourth point, people who attempt to expatriate money or attempt to leave the country as promised by numerous millionaires, I might add, who never did leave, by the way,
yes.
Which says something. But those people who wish to leave the country in order to avoid the ill effects, for example, of Brexit, so they supported Brexit and then they leave. Yeah. Should they be allowed to leave? If they do leave, the argument is in this programme they should be stripped of their assets before they leave. How do we feel about that? So James Dyson, for example, take a good example of this. James Dyson said he's very pro-Brexit, but he now apparently is domiciled, I think is the word, in Singapore.
Yeah.
So that would, under this rule, that would enable us to expropriate him of his profits from his hoovers. We could nationalise his hoovers and continue to manufacture them, and then we'd keep the money. This, we is an interesting concept here. We'll come maybe to the question. Next point 5, for those of you that are still here. Point 5, the abolition of private banks. How do we feel about that? And the creation of a bank, a state bank, or a publicly owned or a cooperative bank, not the cooperative bank, but a collectively owned bank in charge of credit. So in other words, that could presumably finance people to engage in socially useful production or in socially useful communication and developing of networks and building communities generally. Number 6, centralisation of transport in democratic hands. Well, in here in Merseyside, obviously, we're lucky in the Merseyrail, for example, is owned and run by the City Region, which obviously makes a big difference. In Manchester, of course, the mayor there has, I don't think they actually own the buses, but they're regulating them. They've got their own fleet and so on. So it seems that may be uncontroversial. But again, what are your thoughts? What does that make you think? Is that a good thing? 7, give the state more responsibility for supporting industry and for maintaining the natural environment. Now, those two might initially seem contradictory, but they don't have to be, because, of course, There's been a lot of talk recently of green jobs. And the rebuilding and reconstruction that we need to do is a massive undertaking. Now, that could create jobs. So that point 7 there is one whole point, really, isn't it? Point 8, the right of everyone to have meaningful work. A programme of public employment. So that could go with point 7, couldn't it?
Yeah.
So if people have objections so far, that's very interesting. Obviously, we're not in a public debate forum, but if you have issues with this, if you don't understand it, now's the time you can think this through. You can come back to it, pick it up again, think it through. Point 9. Try to level. This is a deliberately controversial word here. Try to level the differences between the towns and the country. Now, I grew up in a new town, which is a weird fish in its own right. Maybe we'll come back to some of these points later. I grew up in a new town. There's a big urban-rural divide in this country. Urban communities are often very densely overpopulated and lack resources in one kind of way. They're often deeply impoverished. They also contain vast concentrations of great wealth in specific areas, very tightly geographically concentrated, shall we say. Yeah. In the countryside, you often get deserts where there are no decent shops, there's no post office, there's no pub. You get villages where everyone is either below 18 or above 40. And it's no kind of life. You get these tiny little hamlets of 100, 200 people without any kind of public transport and so on. Now, this is a strange historical position to be in. It's not the norm.
Yeah.
It's not the norm. If you go and visit towns, in inverted commas, in a touristy beauty spot, so say you go to the Peak District or the Lake District, the economies of those towns is entirely distorted by tourism.
Yeah.
So you can ask yourself, what would happen to those towns if they were both bigger? What would that necessitate? If wealth was more equally distributed between town and country, if young people were able to stay in those communities, what would that mean? And finally, point 10, now I don't think this is going to be too controversial, but free public education, and that's an interesting question. How much should we allow commercial considerations to be involved in public education at all? What does it mean to have free public education? I mean, we have education that's free, but it's distorted by the private sector. Should we abolish the private sector? It's also distorted by the provision of models and educational materials that are not free, that have an agenda, but also are commodified.
Yeah.
And then part of that point is abolition of child labour. And again, it's amazing that should be in this programme of change. Is there anyone who thinks child labour is a good thing? Well, when you look around the world, you have to come to the conclusion that there are an awful lot of people who think child labour is a good thing because it's unbelievably widespread in this country and beyond. It might be illegal here, but it happens. So, Craig, you're a very educated person. Can you tell me what document those 10 points are drawn from? Have a guess. Don't worry if you can't. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just interested. Do you recognise those 10 points?
Well, I recognise them kind of ideologically. There's kind of clearly there's kind of anarchist principles in there, as there are socialist principles. You could even argue that there are aspects of communist principles in there as well. So
you'd be right to, because that's the Communist Manifesto. So what I want to ask people, as a way of introducing critical thinking, and thinking about what that means, is what would have happened if I said, here is the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
Now, I invite you to think about that for a minute, and I would suggest, obviously, you can press pause if you like, while you're thinking about that, and then come back when you've stopped pressing pause. Sorry, that's a very clumsy way of putting it. Come back when when you're ready. Now, if that was presented as the Communist Manifesto before you heard any of those points, my question is, would it change the way you thought about those points?
Yeah, I think definitely it would, because it's the kind of connotations that are attached to certain types of ideology and the way that they've kind of been hijacked in very negative ways through the media in my opinion, to prevent people thinking critically along different lines. It's kind of already hijacked, so there are certain sound bites out there that are kind of used to hijack certain types of ideas to for me, prevent critical thinking. So I think you're right. To kind of couch it in those terms initially would kind of prevent further open-minded engagement with those, I think, pretty straightforward ideas.
to me, those are all worthy aims because that's my position. We'll come back to position in a moment, but there are some complexities within them. But nevertheless, it's hard to object to most of them on principle and just when you first hear them. You might have technical objections, you might have other kinds of objections, and people with different positions and coming from opposite sides of the political spectrum would naturally object to some of them, especially things like abolition of inheritance and so on.
Yes.
Obviously they would, that's fair enough. But the point is it's about the filters that we use, isn't it? So again, if you were to work through those programs with children or with anyone who's not familiar with the Communist Manifesto, without saying it's the Communist Manifesto, it would be interesting whether they respond to it differently, as opposed to if you said, right, we're going to look at the Communist Manifesto now, and this is what it involves. And people immediately, of course, think Cuba, if you're lucky, or North Korea, if we're not lucky. So there you go. There's an introduction to maybe some of the things that critical thinking can offer us. Before we start unpicking it in detail, I think there's a couple of other things here that are quite important, one of which I've touched on, one of which we haven't quite touched on yet. And then maybe we can then talk about political education as well. The first thing I wanted to touch on is positionality. So some people will obviously be familiar with this, and in a way, in a nutshell, it's your position is, who am I, where do I fit in, how am I seen, but also what power do I have? Or am I oppressed in certain dimensions perhaps as well, depending again entirely on your position. And the point about mentioning positionality is it's really important, and it's denying that it's important and not thinking about it critically has enabled certain kinds of people to dominate the discussion around education for a very long time. So it needs to come in here. So but power is embedded within positions. So to take me, I mentioned I'm from a new town. So that's one of the things that defines how I look at the world. And new towns are sort of strange creatures. They began as maybe sort of to the left of the social democracy. So they began as a kind of egalitarian experiment, and it's certainly in improving living conditions for people. But then they got captured by corporate interests. So the new town I grew up in was entirely built around nuclear families, cars, and work. And that obviously affects everybody in it. It had when I was young, there was no theatre, no arts gallery, no nothing like that. So I grew up in an environment that meant that I had some privileges in some ways, but I had no kind of cultural education, if you like. I had no cultural capital. So when I went to university, I suddenly bumped into all these people who knew how to talk about art and theatre, and I was completely baffled by it. Now, obviously, in other ways, I have a great deal of privilege. For one thing, I went to an elite university, and that, like it or not, confers privilege on me. The fact that I was miseducated by that university isn't really anyone else's problem, it's mine, and it's something that has to be constantly unpicked, but it does confer privilege on me. So there's a couple of other points as well to make, which is, without going into details, but I am neurodiverse because I have something called complex PTSD, which is derived from what are often referred to as adverse childhood experiences. So that affects the way I think. It's not entirely negative, so I would say that I live with it. It means I tend to leap around a lot, as we've discussed, and as might happen here. That's one aspect of it. But it also informs my understanding of other kinds of experiences that people have. It doesn't necessarily mean I understand them, but it does give me something to go on. Also, I happen to be hearing impaired, and with tinnitus, which is another story again. But it does mean it's not I don't feel oppressed by it. To be clear, it just means now and then I haven't got a clue what anyone's saying. But so these are some of the things that I mention these not because I'm trying to add up the things that have given me privilege against the things that have in some way perhaps held me back. I don't believe that is what we're trying to talk about here. I don't believe that's the right approach. I think there's a tendency, especially if you've had more privilege in your life, maybe you look around. This is a question. I don't know what people think about this. Maybe people sometimes look around for something that means they've got a little bit, they've been a little bit oppressed here and there as well. So we're not trying to get a kind of figure, a number that gives us where we are on a scale of any kind. The important thing about position is how it affects way you relate to people, and particularly in this context, in education, it might affect how you relate to your students or the people that you're working with, your colleagues, and it might have an impact on what you're trying to say. So those are the key things. So trauma, for example, is very widespread. If you don't understand how it operates, it means that you can misread what's going on in a group of people. So if you've got some insight into what the effects of trauma can be, which can be very different for different people, obviously, but that can actually then influence your pedagogical practice. So that's why these things are relevant. And that brings me on to the second thing I wanted to mention, which is about power. So the interesting thing I think about power in this context is when we talk about political education and critical thinking, we also begin to address issues that are to do with things like free speech, for example, academic expression. There's various ways of labelling that. And I think one of the questions there comes up time and time again is, what are the limits of this? Now, the thing about critical thinking is it's question-based. But it's not enough just to ask questions. In conversations, in the broadest possible sense, there are power imbalances, aren't there? So in certain kinds of speech, there is implied or actual violence embedded within the speech. In certain kinds of discourses, which is not a word I like because it's overused, but in certain kinds of discourses, for example, between governments and communities who are at the sharp end of government policies, there are massive power imbalances. You see this a lot, for example, in fake consultation exercises, which are very prevalent. So
that term certainly rings a bell.
Yes, people will hopefully be thinking of examples where they've been asked to been consulted about something, and then the consultation process hasn't resulted in any change, or they've not been informed of the results, or it was clearly simply a data collection trick.
Well, yes, certainly in my experience, because I've got a trade union background, so when I was branch chair for a number of years, and quite often we fought against the organisational interpretation of consultation, which generally meant we're making these changes and we're telling you about them. So there you go, you've been consulted. And for us, it's that that's kind of cascading, that's kind of instructing us in what's going to happen. That's not consultation. Our interpretation of consultation is to actually sit down and kind of negotiate the parameters of the problem.
And also to look at if people with power are consulting people who are less powerful.
Yes.
And the people who are ostensibly less powerful say, actually, we would like to shift the agenda completely and talk about this. A sign of whether the consultation is meaningful or not is whether that agenda can actually be shifted.
Definitely.
And you see that a lot in the way that local authorities and central governments consult people. There are other ways of controlling that conversation as well. One of them is not to tell anyone you're having a consultation, of course, which does happen quite frequently. Another one is, obviously make it time limited, but also there is all sorts of kinds of ways in which consultation can be rendered meaningless. One of them is to create online consultations or surveys that are inaccessible by large numbers of people because they don't go online, or because they don't speak English, or they don't have sufficiently skilled written English to engage in a consultation and so on. There's all sorts of different things that I've come across in the context of collective encounters work, because we do research in various communities, where systems that are in theory designed to facilitate communication do the precise opposite. And to give you one very concrete example, imagine if anybody listening or watching has tried to ring a GP surgery recently.
Yes.
So there's a 30-second preamble about what is and isn't tolerated in terms of behaviour towards staff. But then there are a number of options. Now imagine doing that if you don't speak English properly. I say properly, that's a loaded word in itself, but if English is not your first language, is what I should say. So if English is not your first language, that's a nightmare. If you're hearing impaired, it's a nightmare. Even mildly hearing impaired, if you're not used to working online, if you don't have a smartphone, there's a number of different paradigms at work here, aren't there? So when when that kind of expands into the political arena, then you get power is wielded in such a way, I think, that there are many kinds of communication that are violent. And as you'll be aware, probably there's a whole school of thinking around non-violent communication that originated in the civil rights movement in the United States, I think. But there is a great deal of power embedded within speech, isn't there? So
I think just on that, because it's really, you've really piqued an area of interest of mine, which is bureaucracy. And David Graeber's work on the utopia of rules, I think it is, where he unpicks wonderfully the tyranny of this kind of one-directional tyranny of bureaucratic forms of it's not even communication, it's the control and the flow, the controlled flow of information from power to less powerful people. Because the term exactly bureaucracy is bureau is French for desk, and kratos, which relates to power. So therefore, bureaucracy is kind of the imposition of power through the desk. You know, it's often it's faceless people that you have no recourse to. You can't kind of say, hang on a minute, let me just speak to somebody, because there's nobody that you because the machinery of the bureaucracy doesn't allow that. So therefore, you are entirely subjected to what the computer, the machinery that the system says and what it allows, and often it allows for no kind of kickback or flowback of information or democratic challenge.
That's right, and obviously if AI is involved, which it increasingly is, it doesn't even allow for out of the ordinary questions or the unexpected. Also, as is well documented, I think, AIs contain algorithms that are biased. So there's quite a lot of work, increasing amount of work being done on the biases within algorithms. There are some fairly extreme examples of that, and there are some much more subtle examples of that. But there's a real concern, I think, about bureaucratic processes and the way they are AI driven. In whose interest is the information being collected, but also why is it so unresponsive? It's being sold to us. This is one of the things that happens now in terms of the violence contained within the non-communication that we get from government. Is that the idea is that the government wants to help. So you ring the DWP and you get you're supposed to get a really helpful automated assistant, shall we say. That's one example of how it's supposed to work. But of course the opposite is true. The government actively is discouraging us from obtaining information and obtaining our rights. They're called benefits, but they're rights. This is another very interesting use of violent language, isn't it? It's violence. Violence is being done to the way we think about the language, and violence is being done to us as a consequence of the changing of the idea of rights into benefits in that context. But the other violence that's done is done through the way that things are reversed in terms of the way we think about them. So the idea is that the government proclaims it's being helpful, or that maybe we should say the DWP in this context, which obviously the bureaucracy persists beyond political divides. It doesn't matter who's in power. The bureaucracy has been developing in this direction for a very long time. And so what happens is the bureaucracy itself is invasive. It does not help you. It actually actively frustrates your attempts to access your rights. And it does that in a number of brutal and overt ways, but it also does it in a number of covert ways by, for example, narrowing down the range of what options are available in an automated system. So no wonder that government ministers are currently being triumphalist, perhaps, about AI and what it might do for us. So there's just, this is probably another topic for another podcast, the whole nature of AI. But AI is not going to be wielded within our, in our best interests. It's going to be used, and already is being used, to harvest information, but also to inflict violence on certain kinds of people. A really good example of that is facial recognition software, which has conclusively been demonstrated to be biased. It will automatically seek out black and brown people to a much greater extent to white people. The complexities of that are available if you look up, if you have access to various research papers, you'll find quite a fair amount of information about that. There are a number of people who've documented this tendency. So you can see that the use of certain kinds of systems that are AI driven contain within them highly flawed algorithms that recognise certain kinds of people as criminal and give a free pass to certain other kinds of people. The interesting thing I think about AI generally is the extent to which this is business driven. So the AI requires massive investment and massive infrastructure to be implemented. So in terms of critical thinking and political education, getting back to the point, did you see what I did there?
Yes, absolutely.
So in terms of enabling people to think critically, if you can use AI to narrow down options, then that excludes the whole ranges of potential modes of thought. Health is a key concern here because a lot of therapy is now being offered online. It will only be a matter of time, I feel confident, before the NHS embraces AI-driven therapy, which I use NHS services. I would find that deeply alarming because it takes away the whole nature of embodied connection with people, which is possibly the most therapeutic thing that can happen in the right context. So there's a worry that AI will be used increasingly to prescribe, I think. You'll ring up the doctor in that automated system that I told you beforehand. Well, it already happens. If you've ever tried to contact a doctor online, you now go through a whole series of things where you write down various kinds of symptoms and it asks you various questions like, are you having a heart attack? Yes, go to hospital. Well, fair enough. But, if you're not having a heart attack, you go on to a series of more complex questions. And those are then analysed. At the moment, I don't know quite how they're analysed. I'm assured by my surgery that they do triage on them, but at what point will an AI triage nurse, as it were, be inserted into that process?
Well, I think what's of kind of equal or of particular importance for me in relation to AI is the kind of the impact that it's having on education as well, because often, society generally, and certainly in Western society, it's become much more kind of fragmented, individualized. Now, kind of, making connections from that to critical thinking and political education, which I think is really important because our ability to sit here today and kind of analyse and deconstruct and make various connections are skills that are developed over kind of extended periods of time, and they are skills. It is very much skills based, but they are skills that I've learned from other people that have kind of passed them on to me, and they're not necessarily, if at all, skills that I've learned through systems of formal education. I was not taught to think critically. At school, I didn't go to college or university. How I learned critical thinking was engaging with trade unionists, was kind of spending time away from formal environments of learning with people, whether that be in the pub or in a cafe, and just talking about things and learning to kind of analyse and deconstruct and take an idea apart. Because when you start to see the mechanisms of an idea or an ideology, you then begin to learn what it's actually made up of, and so therefore you can develop that kind of critical analysis.
That's a really good point, and I also admire the way you brought us back on topic. And you're absolutely correct. Critical thinking, political education, and so on are not taught in any educational institution. And I was fortunate enough, as I mentioned earlier, to go to an elite university. Whether it was fortune or not, I don't know. I mean, but I didn't learn critical thinking there at all. I was miseducated. I'm just miseducated to degree level. Whereas people I work with all the time, people who I engage in research with, quite a few people there left school at 14. There's a range of experiences, but we all agreed that we were miseducated. And so this raises a really interesting question, which is, what is political education? So if we can agree even what it is, why don't we do it as well? So, and in terms of linking that with critical thinking, how do the two tie together? So I suppose the critical thinking is essentially asking questions at the start. So it goes back a very long time. It's Socratic, isn't it? And there's whole traditions of critical thinking. So what, obviously, just in case anyone's thinking this, which I'm sure you're not, but if you are, it doesn't mean criticising somebody. But that's important to say, because at the moment we've got a dearth of information about critical thinking. And people naturally want to ask questions. One of the research projects I did with Collective Encounters, which was also part of the masters that I did at Edge Hill, looked at the status of community-centred knowledge and how people develop tacit experience collectively into useful knowledge that they can then use to make change. And one of the things that was really interesting is we worked with a group, together there was about 12 of us, 13 of us all together, and every single person, as I mentioned before, was miseducated in some way. So some of us had degrees, some of us had left school young. Also, worryingly, every single person had experienced domestic violence as a child or as an adult, which is alarming. In addition to that, there was a range of kind of different other kinds of intersections within the group. So it was, it was a reasonably sort of varied group. But people agreed that research is a fundamental human activity, and it depends on asking questions. So it depends on looking around you and asking why is that the way it is. It's really powerful to do that. So here's a question: why, when we go to school, is that discouraged? Perhaps you feel it isn't. Or, when I say you, I mean the plural, the body of people who may or may not be watching this. Perhaps you feel it isn't, or it certainly isn't the case that everyone's experience is that it's discouraged. But in my experience and in many contexts, I've seen it actively discouraged. So in a primary school, I've seen 8-9-year-olds ask why something, and the teacher has dismissed that. I've often suspected because the teacher doesn't know the answer. But there are structures in place as well that mean there's no time, even if the teacher did know the answer. And some teachers are very conscientious and want to give those answers, of course. But there's no time. The structure does not permit it. The curriculum does not permit it. It's numeracy hour.
Yes.
It's literacy hour. So I don't know. Does that mean that, you can't answer questions about maths in literacy hour? At what point, do we start kind of being completely constrained in our own imaginations by these structures and systems that create kind of these environments in which education takes place?
Can I just ask you that? But is that what you mean by miseducation then? Because you used the term a few times.
Right.
It's an intriguing term, so I'm just wondering, what do you mean by miseducated?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think what I mean by miseducation is this. So I think, firstly, there are two kinds of miseducation. One of them is being told something wrong. The other one is not being told something.
Right.
Okay, so there is erroneous education, if you like, and there is erasure.
Yes.
Now, in the research that I did with the radical researchers, as we called the group I mentioned earlier, the Collective Encounters group, we found that all sorts of information had been erased that we'd all had to discover afterwards.
Right.
Now, you won't be surprised to learn that the information that was erased was to do with a range of topics that included, for example, sexual orientation. It included colonialism. It included the role of the British Empire in making the modern world.
Yeah.
It included economics. No one is educated in economics in this country until they get to A level or degree level. Yeah. And even then they're educated still, despite the best efforts of various people to the contrary, they're generally educated in what is known as classical economics.
Yeah.
Now that might be a topic for another podcast, or we might come back to it later. But there's a great book, by the way, that is a kind of popular critique of classical economics, which I recommend to people, called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? Okay, so that
sounds
captures
wonderful.
a little bit of what's wrong with classical economics. The other, also, we've had the illustration recently from Truss and Kwarteng. The fees that he paid to Eton, he should be asking for them back. He too clearly has been miseducated. So miseducation is erasure, and it is being given wrong information.
Yeah.
So the other aspect that I think is really important to say is this is structural and deliberate. Okay, it's not just accidental. It's not because some teachers are a bit lazy, because most teachers in my experience are not lazy people at all. They're often highly conscientious individuals. Admittedly, I'm nearly 60, so when I was at school, we had some really bad teachers.
As I did,
Really, really shocking teachers, including one history teacher who told us that we would be fine in the exams because when I was at a boys' grammar, right? So when we do exams, he said, you know, boys are better at interpreting things. The girls will just regurgitate what they've been taught, and you'll do better. Even then, we realised there was perhaps something a bit wrong with that. Now, I'm not saying that such gross sexism takes place in the classroom on a daily basis now, but I'm sure lots of other kind of less noticeable sexisms take place with regard to the curriculum across all these dimensions of intersectionality.
Definitely,
there are people that there's history that's not being taught particularly. Yeah. There's so again, to distinguish between erasure and being given wrong information, erasure is being told that not being told about the British Empire. Yeah. Being given the wrong information is being only given the version that Niall Ferguson gives, for example. Or, you know, to give a less... I mean, Niall Ferguson, for all his faults, is a historian. He uses evidence. He argues his case. He abides by some of the laws of academic engagement, if you like. If those laws are good or not, I don't know. But he does kind of... He holds down a job at Harvard. He can't be completely incompetent. Whereas, of course, the Boris Johnson approach to misleading us in terms of history is on another level altogether. And in a way, Boris Johnson's version of history is laughable. We shouldn't perhaps dismiss it because people will read it and they want to hear it, so they'll like it. But it's the Niall Fergusons that I really worry about. There's lots of them about. Yeah. And on the one hand, you've got people who provoke and do extreme versions of that kind of revisionist history. So there's a famous paper that I've completely forgotten the title and the author of, I'm afraid. I should have made a note. But there's a great paper. It's not great, I should argue. It's a terrible paper, but it's a very interesting paper, which is essentially called for the reintroduction of colonialism for countries that wanted it. Okay, no. Now, I can put that... Remind me, and I'll put that reference in the notes.
We shall put that on the square side, definitely.
So we should look at that, because it's interesting to work out what's wrong with this paper. So that's a very extreme example of a kind of Fergusonian type of position. Ferguson argues, amongst other things, that we gave the Empire English and we gave the Indians railways. Now, these points have been made by many people and been thoroughly discredited by a huge range of scholars. Yes. If anyone's wondering about what's wrong with them, just to take one example, the Indian subcontinent, obviously not one country at the time of the introduction of the East India Company's, when the East India Company started working there, started exploiting the country, but they were on the verge of an industrial revolution. They had steel-making industries. They were fully capable of building steam engines and other kinds of technology. Now, that's not something that I knew until I read a particular book about it. It's a book by someone called Taror. Again, I'll try and remember. I'll try and remember to put these references in. So now Niall Ferguson would have it that, it was the British that introduced railways. In fact, the technology would probably have been independently developed. But as it was, whether or not it would have been, we won't know, because the British destroyed the Industrial Revolution in India. It's a really important point. So there's this idea. Walter Rodney, a man whose name I can remember, a Caribbean scholar, wrote an amazing book called How Europe Underdeveloped the West Indies or something. I can't remember the precise title, but if you look up Walter Rodney, my memory is not always particularly great. So, but look up Walter Rodney and you'll find it. And so underdevelopment is a process. It's an intentional process, and it's the handmaiden of, or rather, miseducation is the handmaiden of this process. So, for example, the history that we're taught that is misleading and erases things is taught worldwide. This is another really important point. Yeah. It's taught. There are African schools still that teach those kinds of histories, for example. So there are places where the erasure is of profound consequence. It is to us all, but imagine not being, we're not taught our own history in particular ways, but imagine being taught that the British did your country an immense amount of good when the evidence that they didn't is all around you. Yeah, that's just one example of that. So that's the kind of context for miseducation.
Well, so at that point, kind of moves on to the second question.
Yeah, sorry, I just remembered the Walter Rodney title. It's I think it's how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Right,
I think,
right.
Yeah.
Well, we can confirm that, and again, we can put it on as a reference.
Yeah. As I say, my memory for things like that is not great.
Yeah. So we've covered I think, a wonderful array of kind of issues related to critical thinking and political education and erasure, and what was the other one? The erroneous...
Oh, yeah, so the two kinds of miseducation, erasure, but also being given wrong information.
Yeah.
So that obviously in terms of this kind of idea of political education, an act of political education is to find out the right information and find out what you've not been taught.
Right, well, so that nicely leads us into the second question then, which is, considering the issues and obstacles that we've discussed so far, what might an alternative approach and practice look like?
Okay. So let's just go back to this idea of erasure, and what I suggested, that political education is about dealing with that erasure and about challenging the incorrect information that we are deliberately being fed. And that this takes place in the structure. So I alluded earlier to the idea that educational structures, at least in this country, are places where this kind of miseducation is intentional. Mm-hmm. So that effectively that means that formal education is part of the problem. So this is part of a big process. It's part of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is until recently something that was supposedly to be assumed was an unalloyed benefit to the world at large. Now it's being reinterpreted. There's a big struggle over this, isn't there? There's a big conversation taking place, but there's also some very violent confrontations taking place in terms of the kinds of language that's used and so on, the kinds of acts that are carried out in the name of this conversation around the meaning of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Now, I would argue, on the basis of a number of writers, I would say that the Enlightenment was only of benefit to a small number and certain kinds of people. And in particular, of course, it was basically about enclosing knowledge, amongst other kinds of enclosure, but it was the intellectual aspect of enclosures and of colonialism that sequestered knowledge and recreated it as essentially white, male, and instrumental.
Yeah.
So in other words, it had to have a purpose. So formal education in this country, for example, was constructed as education for work. Working class people fought for their kids to be educated.
Yeah.
It was granted because it was realised that created a workforce. It wasn't granted because the government in the 1880s or whatever suddenly decided they wanted to unleash a wave of critical thinking on Victorian England. I have the feeling they probably didn't want to do that.
I think you might be right.
Yeah. So education, has historically it was initially something that only upper class people got through tutoring. Then what we now call public schools, which of course are private, which is another example of the actual opposite word being used for that which should be. The private education extended it to the merchant classes, which equipped them to enact mercantile capitalism, as it were, didn't it? So it gave them the skills that were needed to manage the huge corporations that at this time were being created, and we mentioned the East India Company earlier on as being one of the first. So this is the sort of background against which the struggle for political education is taking place, and of course there are a lot of people involved in this, all of them much more informed on it than perhaps I am, because of it's a global movement that we're talking about here. So it's quite hard, I think, to sum up a global movement in a reasonable amount of time. So the best thing is to acknowledge that there's all sorts of aspects to this which are really complex, and to say that this is part of the richness of it. So you might argue, I suppose, that the attempt to erase critical thinking, political education, the attempt to replace it with an official history, if you like, is a kind of deliberately monolingual, if you like. It uses one set of ideas. It's got one paradigm. The interesting thing about the alternatives is that they are plural.
Yeah.
So what I can do is I can speak to some of those things that have direct relevance for what we're trying to do here. Yeah. Both what I'm exploring with Collective Encounters and what I'm exploring with my PhD.
Yeah.
So there's a number of people that have influenced that exploration. The first one of them, and in some ways the most important, is Silvia Federici. You may have heard of. I'm always astonished when people haven't heard of her because I think she's one of the most important people in this arena. But Silvia Federici is an Italian academic.
Right.
And she wrote, amongst other things, she's written a lot, but one of her key texts is Caliban and the Witch. Caliban and the Witch.
Ah, yes, I have. Yes.
Yeah, it addresses a period of European development. If development here is not used in a sense implying any kind of progress, it addresses a period where in Europe feudalism was collapsing and mercantile capitalism was rising. And her argument is essentially that when feudalism began collapsing, because feudalism, interestingly, wasn't all bad. This is a topic for another day, but feudalism, there are contexts in which feudalism worked, and then it began to collapse in a very classically Marxist way, if you like, under its own contradictions. As it was collapsing, new things began to emerge. Those new things were, according to Federici, led by women. So this is really important to remember. Mm-hmm. And those movements were egalitarian movements, which were often very religious, but where the religion they embodied and enacted was egalitarian also. And they were millennial even though and it wasn't a millennium, but they were millennial in the sense that they were seeking really radical change right down to the level of that which we share communally, the kinds of unspoken interactions that are important to everybody, and in a sense what you might regard as the spiritual or the numinous world. And they were, Federici argues, they were considered so threatening to the rising mercantile capitalists that they had to be crushed. They were led by women, so the way in which they were crushed inevitably had to be gendered. And this was the genesis of the witch burnings. And no one knows how many women were burnt in this time, but it's a truly shocking number. The best estimates are in the hundreds of thousands. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the genocides. There's a great paper by someone called Gross-Vogel who talks about 4 epistemological genocides, I think he calls them. Some of them were actual as well. So amongst them are the burning of witches, but also the colonial holocausts that were taking place in parallel with that, which Federici links together. So her argument is essentially that the Enlightenment was created by suppressing female knowledge, sequestering it. The Enlightenment then drove this very linear paradigm of rational scientific inquiry, which at its height led Descartes to create the sort of dualistic division between mind and body. So one of the interesting things about the groups that rose up against kind of the foreshadowing of capitalism in the collapse of the feudal period is apparently that they embraced, the mind and body as an entity. They regarded ourselves and our communities as embodied. Mm-hmm. Descartes, for various reasons that again is probably, if you maybe go and check out a philosophy seminar, hopefully they're critiquing his dualism there, so we don't have to do it here. But dualism is a real problem. Descartes, wrestled with it, I think, in good faith perhaps, but he also, in doing so, created this massive divide between the mind and the body. Yeah. Nowadays, all that we know, including studies of what happens to people who've been traumatized, is that they're intimately connected. They're deeply, intimately connected. We think of this seat of feeling as the heart, metaphorically, but we tend to think that we're all in our brains. We tend to think that emotions, rational thought, feelings and so on take place in the brain. They don't. They're completely linked. Anyone will know with the moment. You feel things in your body, don't you, all over. Mm-hmm. But we tend to think that the nerves responsible are in the brain, perhaps, and that the mind is in the brain. It's not. The gut has as many nerve connections as the brain. The heart is also intimately connected. These are all linked by something called the vagus nerve. So the key thing here is that we are not dualistic. Mm-hmm. We are embodied. Yeah. We cannot separate our mind from our bodies. If we could, we'd become something different. I think we'd probably go mad. Yeah. This brings us back briefly, doesn't it, to AI. What would it mean for an AI to be embodied? It would mean something totally different to what it means for me to be embodied, I think. So in terms of the kinds of things we might want to think about in alternative approaches, one of the key things is to recognise the embodied nature of knowledge, and particularly that which isn't spoken. Because again, part of the rational paradigm for the Enlightenment was everything could be written down and everything could be text, essentially. It's very text-based. We know that's not the case. There's all sorts of knowledge that is not capable of being written down directly. We experience it, but you might not be able to put it into words.
Yeah.
But also there are many cultures who don't use text in that way. It's not that they're illiterate, they just don't use text that way. Again, coming back to my own experience and the radical researchers, one of the things that we looked at was the way that people's environments make sense to them, people's local community environments, the places and buildings around them. And one of the things that people considered was that their tacit community knowledge is embedded in that environment. So if you demolish a building, you demolish part of the community knowledge of that environment.
Yeah.
If you destroy a market, this is an actual example, so you destroy a market to make way for housing that no one can afford, that's an act of violence, but it's violent epistemologically. It destroys the knowledge, histories, memories, experiences that are symbolised and embedded within the building that's been lost.
Yeah.
So in a market's one kind of knowledge. It's funny that free marketeers argue that markets are the source of all negotiation, and that it's the way, yet when the market comes, an actual market is under threat because it would make someone some money to build housing on it, they wipe it out. So this is the key point of how we might engage in remedying what's been erased, remedying what's been deliberately taught to us that is a lie. We can use what we know that's communal, that is rooted in our own experience. However, we can't use that uncritically for all sorts of reasons. We also need information from other points of view and other sources. So this is where I can introduce some of the people I referred to earlier. So the first person I'm going to talk very briefly about is Paulo Freire.
Yeah.
So Paulo Freire, as people may hopefully know, was he created something known as popular education. I'm not going to give a biography of him because you can look that up. But the idea of popular education is that it's intentional education towards liberation that attempts to break down or at least reduce the power dynamic between the teacher and the student. He critiqued the traditional mode of education as the banking model of education.
Yeah.
So to talk about miseducation, the idea is I'm an empty vessel. Aged 6, I start school, I know nothing. Therefore, the teacher will then come along and pour into me knowledge. So they'll make a deposit in the bank, as it were. That, as we know, is not the case. There's lots of things a 6-year-old knows. It's amazing what they might know. Imagine what 6-year-olds around the world know right now, thinking what's going on in the world right now. Sadly, many of them probably know way too much about things that no one should have to know about. So the idea that anyone is a blank slate is a typically Enlightenment idea, actually. It's got a lot of antecedents in Enlightenment philosophy. And Freire critiqued that, and then other people came along, most particularly and very importantly Bell Hooks and Antonia Dada, both of whom are still around and writing today, so it's well worth looking them up. They obviously applied a beneficial and comradely feminist critique to the original ideas around popular education.
Well, Bell Hooks died recently. Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
Within the last 12 months, I think.
You're right. I think she did actually. Okay, well, I'm hoping Antonia Dada's still there.
She definitely is still
Good.
around.
I'm very pleased to hear that. The contribution that they, amongst other people, have made to this field is immense. And so that, again, worth looking up the writings of these people. But the point that they all make, especially Hooks and Dada, is you can't turn this into a template that solves everything. So the kind of popular education that we use is permanently evolving, but it also is based on another kind of popular education that found its way here through a whole series of practices that I won't detail now. But some of it, by the way, was rooted within trade union education. One reason for this is that the education, popular education as imagined by all those writers really, takes place in the classroom, whereas we work outside formal education altogether in collective encounters. So that creates a different dynamic even in the popular education environment, creates different kinds of spaces for working in.
So just on that, because the way that you've kind of set that out works really well, I think, because, you know, moving away from this kind of dualistic notion of education towards kind of embodied pedagogic practice, which obviously, as you just mentioned, collective encounters, you sort of embrace and practice an embodied approach. Which you can tell us about in a second. Do you think that is something that has to take place outside of formal education, or do you think it can? Because what's interesting is certainly thinking about the work of bell hooks, because embodied kind of pedagogic practice within the university is something that her work attempts, and I think largely successfully, to embrace, you know, because the way that she talks about love. You know, and her feeling and experiencing love in relation to it, not sexual love, but
of course,
human
love.
connection.
Totally.
So I think bell hooks certainly shows us a way forward as to how it might potentially be practiced within formal educational context. But what are your thoughts on
I think
that?
that's a really interesting and really difficult question. And so I did think, because you put that in the notes, I've tried to think about that, and obviously, again, there's no sort of right or wrong answer, unless there is. Do you know the answer? No, there's clearly a range of opinions on this, and a lot of it depends on structures. So one of the things that struck me about bell hooks is I think it might be in Teaching to Transgress. She talks about, or it might have been in one of her other books, might have been in. No, don't worry about the reference for now. But as I say, my memory on these things is hazy. I have to write these things down, and I haven't got a big list in front of me because that would be rather disruptive, I think, to this process. But she talks about how she grew up during a period of segregation. So she was educated at a black school. Her teachers were therefore black. And then when the United States integrated education, her and her cohort were bussed into white schools. And she makes this point brilliantly, and I have to say I'd never thought of it this way before, but she makes the point brilliantly. It wasn't that the white kids were bussed into the black schools and taught by black teachers, it was the black kids who were bussed into white schools and taught by white teachers. And so straight away her education went through the floor, for obvious reasons, particularly because, of course, she went straight into a racist structure and a sexist one, I would add. So she went into a structure that was deeply antipathetic to her body, to who she was. And she talks very eloquently about that. And the interesting thing about that there is we're looking at educational structures there, aren't we? So you contrast the black colleges, and of course there were black universities and so on, and there still are. Although I think they admit white students now, but they were originally set up to ensure that black students got further higher education. The interesting thing there is it's about the structures. So what I was asking myself is, to what extent are the structures that we work in preventing us, if we're working in formal spaces, what kinds of change are possible and what kinds of changes are not possible? So I want to introduce a concept here that we use quite a lot in collective encounters, which is that of holding actions. So in kinds of theories of change, so we have a theory of change. That's something that's quite important to mention. We can come back to the whole theory in a bit if it's of interest. But one of the things we look at in our theory of change is the idea that there are some actions that you're kind of forced to take in order to make things, in order to make other changes potentially possible down the line. So one holding action is something that everyone who works on the front line in whatever context at the moment is finding. So in the arts, we're finding now, in socially engaged arts practice, we're finding that we have to often feed people before we can do anything else, because people coming in hungry. And I know that's happening in primary and secondary schools, kids coming in hungry. I've been in classrooms and seen kids faint from hunger. Now, leaving aside for a moment, but acknowledging that this absolutely shouldn't happen and just makes me angry thinking about it, but just leaving that to one side for now. The point about holding action is, to what extent does it collude with the status quo? And that isn't always easy to answer. How do we answer that question? I honestly don't know. We're going to get it wrong sometimes, but the holding actions are things that we can think about carefully and then try to enact in such a way that they make more change possible sooner or later. Now, the kinds of things that I thought about here is these formal spaces that you mentioned, can we make them what I call plurally dialectic?
Nice term.
Yeah. So can we have many voiced discussions where we deliberately engage with contrasting ideas within the context of national curriculum restraints in certain contexts, prevents a massive chiller in various educational contexts. It's horrendous what it does, or what it prevents from being discussed. But more subtle than that is, what about the instrumentalisation of students? So if you're a student right now, you could be forgiven for wanting to go in. You've paid for this degree, you want a 2-1 at least, if not a first. And you could be forgiven for arguing that you've paid for it and you should get that, and that you want a good job when you come out. Why on earth do you want to engage? And this is, again, an open question. It's not rhetorical. It's, if you're watching this and you're in this position, why engage with critical thinking? Why, what good is that? How will that help you get a job unless you want to just go straight back into academia, which you may not want to? I don't know. So there's a problem, quite a deep problem. So that led me to think, okay, so that's an issue. How do we deal with that one? Can we therefore decommodify education? So is there something that can happen? Is there a conversation that can take place with students and with anyone engaged in education such that we can look at the issue of to what extent are these expectations on students and lecturers and teachers such that everything is entirely instrumentalised?
Well, I think just to come in on that point, because I think it's a really good point, and because I used to be in charge of the kind of employability/placement module for our students at JMU, and kind of linking into that, you speak to any of the employers, kind of large employers, what's your ideal graduate? What kind of skills do you want, your new employees that have graduated to be equipped with? And almost without exception, it's, kind of critical thinking skills, being able to work independently, problem solving, generating innovative solutions. The type of skills that we sort of generate through our formal systems of assessment tend not to facilitate those skills. However, the type that's not universal across the university. Now, I've got a lot of friends who are artists, and they've been through various, art college, etc., and they all tend to be really critical, articulate people with skills that are able to look at a problem and dissect it in lots of different ways and problem solve it. So those are the types of skills, and I think that comes from being, in a sense, being given a blank canvas, a space that doesn't contain anything, and so therefore they're then tasked to come up with, installations, artifacts that they've created in order to so the space, the blank space, to be able to firstly having to grapple with that, and then to create and generate something new. I think they are kind of essential skills, and I think there's a potential for cross-fertilisation. So subjects such as education studies, the social sciences, all the rest of it, scope to accommodate more space to allow students to come in to problem solve and start thinking for themselves, and not giving a whole list of, there's the question, and this is the set response, almost kind of response by numbers. No, what do you think? And so for me, there should be so much more scope for doing that.
Well, I think you've hit upon a really interesting point there, and I haven't really talked about our theatre for social change practice yet. So, but the interesting thing I think about what you're saying is, when you talk about employers wanting critical thinkers, I think what they really want is analytical thinkers.
Right.
So I think there's something happening in STEM particularly, where what they're looking for is people who can problem solve, not think critically, not think outside the box. What they want is linear problem solving thinking that will mean that they've got people who can debug programs, perhaps, for example, or can talk about process driven manufacturing, or those are just a couple of examples. So what they want is people who can engineer things. They don't necessarily want people who would get distracted looking out of the window, ask themselves a question about, why something is going on in the atmosphere, they want people who will be specifically applying analytical skills and problem-solving skills, perhaps in an innovative way, to build a new kind of wind turbine, say. Now, it's not that we don't need such skills, but I'm not sure that you have to achieve them by narrowing down the range of what it's possible to think and the ways in which it can be thought. And the interesting thing about the pedagogies that we use is that, well, for theatre for social change, for example, take that as the key point about that. There's a whole lot of things I could say about that, which again, they're probably, I won't go into too much detail now. But firstly, we have a theory of change that I mentioned before. And so the theatre for social change is really designed to get people thinking about that which they took for granted before. And so in theory, what we argue is people begin by changing at a moment of personal crisis, perhaps. But change begins personally, but then the kinds of ways in which you think about your community might change, and from there you will maybe start asking questions about wider political issues. Now, interestingly, in the research that I've been doing, I've discovered that there's a whole series of concepts from different fields, not widely different. Obviously, I'm not from physics, say, but there's a whole series of concepts that are very similar, come from different kinds of traditions of thought. So you've got Bourdieu and habitus. Yeah. So habitus is that which we take for granted. It's the way we live our everyday lives, isn't it? In a nutshell, I'm sure it can be unpicked a lot more than that, because he's French. No intellectual more intellectual than a French intellectual, in my opinion. And so habitus is a really important concept, isn't it? Yeah. Then from Freire, you have conscientisation. Maybe you can regard that, if you like, as the point at which we become aware of the habitus. That's one way of thinking about it. From drama, we have a couple of related concepts called making strange, which is understandable, but the point about some kinds of drama, the kind of drama that we practice, partly it's got a relationship, by the way, with Freire through the work of Boal and Theatre of the Oppressed. Making strange, again, it's a bit like just questioning the habitus, isn't it? It's like suddenly thinking, wait, that's a bit weird. Why wasn't I told about the British Empire? Why is there a statue of Queen Victoria in every English city? These are questions that we don't normally think about. There are more subtle questions that you can ask, and I'll come back to those if there's time, if we remember later, because that has impacts for another strand of our practice. From theatre as well, you've got the absolutely wonderful Verfremdungseffekt, which is the Brechtian concept, sometimes translated into English as alienation. Now, Brecht deliberately wanted to remind his audiences they were watching a construct, they were watching a play, and by implication, what is presented in the theatre is a construct, so is society. So it's another way of making strange. From Lefebvre, you get strategic hypotheses. Now, they're akin, in my mind, to provocations. And in drama, we use provocations a lot, and I use them in the context of research. So, for example, with the radical researchers, one of the things we did was I asked people if they thought Liverpool was a colony. And, again, that takes a lot of unpacking. It's a complex, possibly controversial way of putting things, although nowadays I think there's actually a lot of literature on internal colonisation that wasn't even around that in 2020 or whenever I was doing that. So I think it's now being understood that there are some really interesting and complex dynamics by which colonial techniques are re-imported back to the imperial centre. There's one reference it's worth putting in. This concept first became widely discussed by Aimé Césaire in 1950. He called it the colonial boomerang. But again, let's just kind of reference that now. People can go away and think about that and look at it. But the point is that it's these provocations that are used in making strange, in questioning the habitus, in thinking about conscientisation and so on. So what you've got there is a set of related pedagogies that have congruent kinds of moments, if you like, in which people realise something about the world. Now, in formal spaces, getting back to the question, you still with me? In formal spaces, how much is it possible for that to happen? Now, one of the problems with formal educational spaces is that many, many people have been harmed by them.
Yes.
So we go through school, and increasingly, I think as you go through school, a lot of people will be increasingly harmed by their education. And that can be gender-based, it can be to do with racism, it can be to do with more subtle and less visible or maybe that's not the right word, but it can be to do with other kinds of oppression. It can be to do with class. There's a whole lot of different ways in which education can be oppressive. So large numbers of students are harmed by education, not necessarily permanently or badly, but some of them are.
Yeah.
The use of exclusion, for example, and obviously this is really applying to secondary schools in particular, isn't it? It's not applying necessarily to HE.
Mm-hmm.
But the use of exclusions is appalling. Exclusions disproportionately affect students who are neurodiverse and also who are black or brown. Obviously something is going completely wrong there, and isolation and exclusion is very, very harmful. So there are limits, I think, to what can be achieved in formal educational spaces. We work outside them because we're working predominantly with people who've been harmed in some way by their education, as well as a lot of other things that are going on. So, and also, we do work with looked after children, but we don't do that in schools because looked after children are not safe in schools. They're very much more likely to be bullied for various reasons. They can't be open about the fact that they are looked after because that will be stigmatising. That's just a couple of examples. So the way in which education harms us is not just to do with what's taught or what's not taught. It's to do with the structure of schools, the focus on discipline, the concepts that have been imported without any evidence from the United States, such as zero tolerance and so on. One of the interesting things, of course, for FE and HE is what happens when students educated in that way get to FE and HE. No wonder they're not going to be particularly ready to think critically.
Well, I think on that, it is a kind of one of the perpetual issues that I'm kind of confronted with, certainly as I move on to kind of teaching level 6 modules, which, kind of by definition is that they're much more aligned with generating sort of personal explorations of knowledge and being critical and creative. Even at level 6, having been through a couple of years of university level education, there's still a kind of almost a reluctance from students to be free, to be liberated, to be given space to do different things with. And I think it relates to the very thing that you started off with. Had you framed your initial 10 points by saying, this is from the Communist Manifesto, that frames it immediately. And I think to a large extent, because of all the heritage of being subjected to formal education and its constraints and its rigidities and its rules and its conformities, it then becomes incredibly difficult to, at some point, try to break that cycle because you're part of a formal education. Yeah. So I suppose that links into the beauty and the kind of the strength really of community-based education, because it's liberated of that heritage. So therefore, almost immediately, it's a brand new environment. Yeah. It's an environment that's not associated with that. So therefore, we can do different things with it. Yeah. So and do you find that
yes,
there is a willingness and a readiness to?
Yeah. I mean, there's several things here. One of them is that the effect of trauma. So trauma is very prevalent in society for a whole host of reasons, and it's very poorly documented. And I think people mostly associate, they either misuse the word and say, the coffee machine's broken, that's traumatic, I've got PTSD. That's a real example. This happens. Now, we define trauma very definitely as if something that's traumatic is something that will have been a threat to your life, your body, or your psychological integrity. It can be individual, it can be single, so it can be a road accident, or it can be years of abuse as a child. It can be communal, so it can be racial, it can be gendered, and so on. And obviously all these things intersect and overlap. It's very unusual, it's quite often the case people are experiencing trauma from multiple contexts, especially, in the context where it's overtly racialised, for example. And what happens with trauma is it changes, if it goes on long enough, it becomes complex PTSD, and that changes your nervous system in such a way that you learn how to cope in the traumatic situation, and the traumatic situation goes on a while. Those maladaptive behaviours, as they're sometimes referred to rather unlovingly, become what normally happens for you. So give an example. If you've been homeless and you're rehoused, there are certain strategies you might learn on the street to survive. Those are no longer appropriate if you're in a house or a flat that you've just been given, but of course you might still carry on doing them. That might mean that a support worker will wonder what on earth you're doing. unless they are trauma informed, and that might mean that you lose the house. And obviously that does happen quite a lot. People quite often struggle to be rehoused if they've been homeless for quite a while. Now, so in the context of education, if you've been traumatised, you will have learnt various strategies, won't you, for resisting the attempt to both give you wrong information, but also to tell you not to tell you that which you know to be true already. So let's think about this for a minute, right? I said that much information is erased in education, but that information, we know it's there somewhere. And students from, for example, students from certain communities who maybe are at the sharp end of colonial processes, some of them at least will be aware entirely of those processes. Most of them, if not all of them, will have had experience of police harassment, sadly. So that will affect the way, because it happens every day, so that will affect the way that you relate to a formal educational space, and therefore you will learn ways of getting through that, because it's not conducive to your well-being. You'll find other ways, other places of, trying to keep your well-being going. You'll find other places, other things to do, maybe that will give you the information you want, if you're lucky. So then, if you then go on to an FE or a HE environment where you're suddenly asked what you think, you're going to be quite suspicious. Probably it doesn't. It'll be difficult, I think, to suddenly reframe the institution in a way that, even if that institution is going to be beneficial to you, which is by no means guaranteed. If you go to one of the Russell Group universities, you will see statues everywhere of colonial oppressors. So you've got every reason to think that the discussions that you're having with your tutors may also cause problems. It might not, but you probably find that some of them will. I mean, I'm white, and I got in trouble at university for asking basic questions about economics because it didn't fit the paradigm. So, if I had less privilege, that process would presumably have been a lot harder. And when I say I get into trouble, I mean I got dismissed. I got told not to be stupid, things like that. So imagine that going on and on and on and on and on. So education is harmful. So there's a limit, I think, to what can be done with these holding actions. So one example of that is there's a lot of talk about decolonised curriculums. Great, we need that. And we can use that for ourselves. We can decolonise that. I find I have to get up in the morning and kind of wash my brain out because all the stuff I'd learned when I was young is lurking within there, coming out ready to get me. So I get up and I have to sort of do that every morning. But that just because you've decolonised your curriculum does not mean the university has been decolonised, obviously. Clearly, you look at who's working there, perhaps look at who's emptying the bins, maybe. I'm not saying that of every university, but it's worth checking, isn't it? It's a good question, isn't it? So there have been some attempts where students have managed to do some things in these directions, and it's useful maybe to just quickly refer to them. So one thing I think that didn't work was in the wake of the crash of 2008, and for maybe about 5 or 6 years afterwards, there were quite a lot of student groups that were demanding a better economics curriculum, including the famous one at Manchester. Now, as far as I know, they didn't manage to change the curriculum, but they would have changed the way they think and their colleagues think. But one successful self-organised student space that I'm aware of where and I've participated in actually, where they are doing great work in this direction with the support of allies within the teaching body, is something called the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective, or CLAREC for short. And again, we can provide links to that. And CLAREC organised conferences around Freirean practices. And they obviously mainly focus on the Latin American context, but they have a presence at Cambridge and they have a presence at various Brazilian universities. Brazil, by the way, I just want to pause for a moment and big up Brazil, because it's an intellectual powerhouse. So students of education, if you're not already checking out Paulo Freire, I hope you will do, but also Brazil is full of the most extraordinary practice within education, the most deep thinkers, and it's got a very strong, vibrant intellectual tradition right now. If you can go to a conference, even online, where Brazilian academics are speaking, pick them first, for example. So look up, there's someone, for example, who I've worked with called Ignacioli, who writes a lot about critical pedagogy, who's well worth reading. But also, don't think I've mentioned him yet, but Boaventura de Sousa Santos
course.
very much part of the Portuguese-speaking world, and I think works in Coimbra University in Portugal, but has a lot to do with Brazil as well.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we'll come back to him as we start finishing off. I don't know where
Indeed,
we are with time.
yes.
So that's what I suppose is the problem with structures, is how much can we change them from within? How much do we need spaces without, as it were, outside them?
Yeah.
And, coming back to that problem that for many people education's been harmful, it's not a conducive environment. So you were asking me if we found embodied approaches in the arts to be successful, and the answer is yes, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's several reasons for that. One of them is somatic. So we do stuff where we move. We don't put people under pressure in any way, but we reconnect with the body,
Mm-hmm.
which works well if you've been traumatized, but it just works well generally. It's a massive struggle to begin with, reconnecting with the body. We're so disconnected from it, it's actually really difficult.
Yeah.
So we have loads of techniques that gently reintroduce people to that sense of using the body to play, to create. And the great thing about that is there's a whole host of techniques which don't require language at all. So we can work across cultures and languages. We can share information without speaking. There's some very, some classic ones being the example of like freeze frame photographs. You can give a group of people a word like power, and they will create a freeze frame that illustrates what power means to them. You can then get them to take the word freedom and create another freeze frame that illustrates freedom. Now, the interesting bit comes with, right, you've got power, you've got freedom. How do you move from power to freedom? And it can be done without speech. So it's very powerful.
Yeah.
And it means, I've done this in the context of land pedagogy. We may not have time to go into land pedagogy, but recently have been using these techniques in exploring this idea of land pedagogy, which gets people to think about the environment they live in the ways that we were discussing earlier, and particularly where power is in that environment. People do not need any experience of drama in this. They just need the courage and a space where they feel both, as it were, safe and brave enough to move a little. Mm-hmm. So there's various straightforward ways to get people into that. Different groups of people react in different ways. The people I found the most difficult, although they were willing, was a group of trainee public health registrars. We did manage to get them to move a little bit. We didn't put too much pressure on them. So a lot depends on your position, as we were saying earlier. Some of the people I've seen who've embraced this way of working the most enthusiastically have been people who work on the front line of health provision. They work for community innovation teams or clusters of GP practices and so on. And they turned out to be really, really good at this stuff, partly because they know what they're talking about. They know the places they're in, they know the issues. So the material's there, they just didn't realise there was a technique that could be used to articulate it in another way. Mm-hmm. And it's fun. Okay, so it's play. This is the other important thing. Also, it's voluntary. School is compulsory.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting debate, isn't there? There's a massive question about what would happen if school wasn't compulsory. And obviously, for most of us, it's not an option to homeschool. It's not an option to opt out. It just isn't. The myth of choice in schools is prevalent but completely illusory. Yeah. Unless you can afford to, I know there are people who have supposedly moved, area or town to get their kid into a better primary or secondary school, but it's generally not possible to do that. And obviously, if you don't have the capacity to move house, which most people don't, then you're not going to do that. So, but these forms of activity are voluntary. We're just in the process of completing a really big study of youth theatre provision and in the city region and what makes it work. And one of the things that's come out of that is that young people who have experienced barriers to participation at school in any other contexts for a whole variety of intersectional reasons are wildly overrepresented in youth theatre. That implies, at least, that it's a much safer space for them to be the way they are. So it's effective, but of course the problem is it's not many people doing it because the funding for this kind of practice is competitive and limited and decreasing. And drama in schools is more or less dead. Even in secondary schools, drama and music are very neglected. And I think that's deliberate. It comes back to what you were saying earlier about the artists who think critically and maybe can help the scientists solve problems. I know that's a very, very cliched way of putting it, but that was sort of the essence of what you were saying, and I agree.
Yeah.
And who wants people who can solve problems right now?
Yeah, well, it is exactly what we need.
Yeah,
but,
it's
but
what we
as you
need.
said, there is definitely a kind of political
Who wants it?
kind of.
Gillian Keegan thinks kids are all right working in port cabins. Would be curious to know, and I honestly don't know the answer. Was she educated in a port cabin herself?
I don't know, but
I don't know.
I would assume not.
Yeah. And why does she think it's okay for other people to be educated in temporary buildings? What does that say about the importance of education, for God's sake?
Yeah.
Anyway,
so I'm just mindful of time.
Yes. Is anyone out there still?
And looking, so everything that we kind of set down on the sheet to work through, I think we've really nicely addressed. So I think just kind of moving towards a final kind of point, which I think I will frame for you in the following way. So, are there any kind of final, almost, sort of key points to end on, including, if it's relevant, are there any kind of key theorists or key theoretical pieces of work that you think, needs to be kind of one of the concluding points to kind of encourage people to think about and read around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So key theorists. Well, I would say check out the. You might help me with this because you're involved with it too. The International Conference on Critical Education and the the ICCE and the associated publication, the Journal of Critical Education Policy Studies. So that's somewhere. JSEPs, yeah. So that's somewhere to begin in the field to look at the kinds of literature that's out there, because it's vast. It's wide-ranging. Yeah. Interestingly, most writing about critical education refers to formal educational spaces. So if you're interested in the informal, you could look at applied theatre texts. So now the trouble is, there's a lot of key texts here, and I've mentioned quite a few of them already. So in terms of other key, applied theatre, you could look at, you could look us up, but you could also look at people like Sheila Preston, Tim Prentke, Vic Merriman, who is one of my PhD supervisors, Victoria Foster, who is another one of my PhD supervisors, and sorry, there's someone else on the tip of my tongue. I'll come back to that. James Thompson, who is the professor of applied theatre at Manchester University, who's written very cogently about the limits of it, and ways in which paradigms of applied theatre cannot be necessarily taken from one culture and applied in another. So there's a great book by him called Performance Affects with an A. Mm-hmm. Then there are people like Rustam Barucha, who's extremely important in kinds of terms of cultural paradigms, aesthetics and so on. So he critiques Western paradigms of applied theatre and of pedagogical practice from the point of view of the global south. And he looks at aesthetics and how they're culturally constructed and the kinds of aesthetics we might need for liberation. So he's great to check out. Those are sort of some starting points, I suppose. I would recommend thoroughly the book I meant, or the Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Yeah. Now, he's not talking really. He's writing about very broad topics. He's writing about epistemological justice. The book that I find very useful by him is called The End of the Cognitive Empire. So the other thing is I mentioned earlier that I think laterally for various reasons. So don't read just within your field. Mm-hmm. Go wherever your passions take you. Read something that's apparently got nothing to do with your field. Read Caliban and the Witch. It's an absolutely fundamental text. It's very readable as well. It's quite grim in terms of the history it relates, but it's related in a very engaging manner. And more recent work by Federici looks much more at things like embodiment and so on as well. So check these people out and then read around them, I would. So those are just sort of some starting points, but there's just masses of literature out there that critiques lots of different aspects of education in these contexts. So yes, I would say for formal education within formal spaces, but in the critical terms, look at the ICCE stuff and go from there. Informal practices to do with facilitated spaces where we kind of co-create the space and make something happen in it. Look at theatre texts of various kinds. And, check out Boal, Boal's flawed and interesting in loads of really important ways. So you can go from Freire to Boal to Hooks to Antonia Dada. But then from Boal you can also venture into other places like look at legislative theatre, which is how the practice of theatre for the oppressed has evolved. So look at the work of New York Theatre of the Oppressed, and look at the work of Katie Rubin, who's someone we work with, where her work is, some of her recent work has been to reshape the homeless strategy for Greater Manchester Council. So those are some starting points, just some. You might start in a totally different place, and that's fine. This is the whole point. It's very heterodox.
Yeah.
There isn't one historian that will tell you everything. It doesn't matter what anyone says. I also recommend reading people who you violently disagree with. Read Niall Ferguson. I need to understand why he's wrong. He is wrong. He is wrong. He's factually incorrect in some ways, and he's wrong in various other ways about his interpretation. Read, I think it's Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I think it's called. It's an absolutely terrible book, and it's very popular. We need to understand why these kinds of books are popular. We need to be able to critique them in the proper sense of the word. Yeah. Critical thinking. Don't just read David Graeber, he's fantastic. But don't just read David Graeber. Read some of the people who we're arguing against in these contexts. Mm-hmm. Understand why they're saying what they're saying. Are they enacting violent speech against us effectively? A lot of what they're doing is erasure. Steven Pinker's extraordinary in what he erases. Yeah. I really hope I've got his name. I'm pretty sure it's Steven Pinker. There's lots of Stevens who are academics, and some of them are good.
Well,
I'm pretty sure it's Steven Pinker, and the book is definitely something like The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's about violence. He has this thesis that violence is declining and that we've never lived in a more peaceful world. Can you, dear listener, dear viewer, ask yourself, do you feel that is correct? How does that equate with your own experience? Don't forget your own experiences, the experiences of your communities, the place you grew up in, your colleagues and so on, all the people you're working with. These are another form of knowledge that you can go to. You can put together with other people. You can be open about it. You can move from the tacit to the explicit, can't you? Mm-hmm.
Well, on that note, what an absolute tour de force. So many thanks for your time, your expertise, and your contributions, Aidan. So it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's been really amazing to be given this space, obviously, and I'm very conscious of that, of having that space. So thanks very much. And references to follow.
Indeed. Thanks again.